There are moments in every person's life when they face intense adversity. They're crucibles that forge who they become as individuals and as leaders. Now more than ever, we need leaders who are called to a higher standard, focused on leaving it better than they found it, and paying it forward to the next generations. Now, let's join Fire Chief Randy Brugman as he speaks with leaders from all walks of life, as he explores and learns from their personal journeys and the crucibles that have forged them into better leaders and better people.
Welcome to another episode of the Leadership Crucible podcast. Today it's an honor for me to have on John Gerzema. John is a pioneer in the use of data to identify social change and help leaders and organizations anticipate new trends and demands. A New York Times bestselling author, pollster, social scientist, and consultant, his research and speaking, including 2 TED Talks and plenaries at the World Economic Forum, the Millikan Institute Global Conference, and speeches around the world. His analytic models include economic and social perceptions of nations, U.S. News and World Report Best Countries with the Wharton Institute School of Business, and the Unilever's Worker Gender Equity Appeal, and John's article, The Trouble with Brands, was named to the top management articles of the decade by Strategy and Business. Among several best-selling books, Spend Shift, How the Post-Crisis Values Revolution Will Change the Way We Buy, Sell, and Live, portended the rise of conscious consumerism and ESG-driven business. And the Athena Doctrine, How Women and the Men Who Think Like Them Will Rule the Future, with Pulitzer Prize winner Michael D. Antonio, identified the rise of empathetic leadership and women's empowerment 3 years before Me Too. Tom Peters said the Athena Doctrine is a powerful book, extraordinary research, great storytelling, a message of both timely and monumental importance. John is a distinguished fellow at the Athena Center for Leadership Studies at Barnard and serves on the board of the UN Girl Up campaign, University of the People, and National Kidney Foundation, where he served as national chairman. John was named to the Hall of Achievement at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University in 2014. Well, John, thanks for being with us on the Leadership Crucible podcast. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show today.
Randy, it's so great to be here with you and everybody.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. You know, how did your path lead you to become a social and a data scientist?
You know, it's an interesting question. I actually spent a lot of time traveling early on in my career, both in the States, and I had 2 years as a youngster, a guy back when I had hair, when I was traveling across the country. And I was through 48 states in 2 years. And then I got into a job where I was traveling all over the world, working for brands like Coca-Cola and Unilever and others, and got exposed to a lot of different cultures. And I just got really interested in how people think, and sort of the way I've thought about that kind of pursuit of understanding society is business and brands and leaders really need to be able to constantly take the pulse of society, because it's complex and there's lots of shifting desires and needs and shifting values. And those are the things that we try to track at the Harris Poll to sort of help leaders adapt and adjust to a very complex society.
Yeah, well, and you've just done some really interesting work. I know you've written several texts on, you know, just what you're seeing from a societal perspective and the shifts that are occurring. And you know, what trends are you seeing today that are going to have some significant impact and the effects in the future? Yeah,
we're, Randy, always looking for sort of some of the hidden signals that might sort of show how people are thriving or even just surviving. One of the more interesting trends that we found recently was that grannies or grandmothers are actually the hidden driver of some of the economic recovery this year. It was fascinating, Randy. We found that the majority of employed adults rated grandmothers second behind getting professional child home care. And we had nearly 50% of these employed workers say without having a mother, a mother-in-law, a father, father-in-law in there to sort of help with children, that they wouldn't have been able to keep their jobs.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of things that we're looking at. And I think, if I had to think about it maybe in two different ways, maybe thinking about other aspects of life, there's some real significant changes in how Americans are thinking about their relationship between their quality of life and their identity and how they think about work. One of the things, Randy, that was really interesting, 71% of Americans say today that their quality of life is determined by how they spend their time and their energy rather than how much money they make.
Wow.
And another 64% said that their top goal is improving their life and optimizing that energy and time over money. So that's just sort of one example of how people are sort of thinking differently today.
Yeah, it's just really fascinating to me, this shift, and we'll talk a little bit about the post-pandemic lifestyle, if you will, and how that impacted that thought process. But going back to the grandmas and the grandpas, and just the impact that that's had on young people being able to go back to work. What if you take that another step farther? What role does the government play in maybe helping to support child care and things like that? It's been a big discussion. I know, at least in the state of Wisconsin, about should we invest in helping young people to be able to take their kids to daycare and things like that. So, but this kind of indicates that maybe there's a strategy there.
I think so. And it's real interesting when you poll Gen Z and millennials, sort of roughly folks under 45 versus Gen X and boomers, you get really different reactions to an idea around social capitalism versus just pure capitalism. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that young people, particularly Gen Z, are very open to education credits, some sort of universal basic income, tuition kind of relief on student loans, and then obviously healthcare, which is across the board just one of the most major obstacles in sort of keeping Americans working.
Yeah. So what changes have you analyzed post-pandemic, and which may have lasting impact on society, and which are probably going to fall away here shortly?
Yeah, so we spent the entire period of the COVID, beginning in March of 2020, starting a weekly COVID tracker, and we provided advisory to the CDC. We opened up our data for free to health organizations, to hospitals, to doctors, and also to journalists, the news media, to try to understand how American life was changing and adapting. And early on, there was all kinds of really interesting adaptations as people went home. One of the most popular things that was in consumers' shopping carts at that time, and it shifted obviously quickly from grocery stores to people using Instacart and Shopify and all that. Yeah. But it was large things of orange juice, everything became big portion sizes. Americans went back and started breakfast. There was family dinner nights. People were cooking, and you've read so much about the sourdough bread making and all that other stuff. Well, some of that started to change pretty quickly, and Americans got into revenge spending, and that really lifted the outdoor dining scene. And if you were like me here in New York City, you were sitting outside with your wife and daughter in 20-degree weather, having sort of COVID dinner because you felt like you've been shut in long enough. Yeah. But I think most importantly, the longer term things that are sticking are clearly hybrid working. The incredible popularity of remote work. We looked at that all throughout the crisis and COVID, and it continued to just grow in popularity. And while I have some personal views on it, I love being in the office. I love having my folks around with me. I also enjoy being home a day or two a week and being able to work that way too. So that has definitely stayed And it's become interesting for the reasons, Randy. One of the most interesting reasons that emerged in our data was that women executives and BIPOC executives, professional workers, felt more seen and heard at home than they did in the office. Now you ask yourself, why is that? Well, the office has been set up around certain conventions, very masculine environments, very, we joke about it, when the idea of being pale, stale male, but seriously behind that was that women executives felt not only was it the free time and the ability to sort of manage life and home and house and work, they felt they were far more efficient, but they also felt they were far more effective in their jobs. So it wasn't about what remote work was doing. It was about what the office wasn't doing. And I think that's a continual struggle that we have to change, because we are now seeing this shifting, tsunami of Gen Z workers coming in who are really remaking the workplace.
Yeah. And what are you seeing from the owner side, if you will? I mean, what's their perspective on how they're managing this transition?
Yeah, it's real interesting. If you step back and we poll with the Milken Institute every year at their global conference in May, and we polled all their executive leaders. So it was a very elite sample. These are CEOs and leaders in business around the world. And it was fascinating, Randy. 76% of these leaders said that changing generational values are going to have a major disruptive impact on our business in the future. And that was higher than geopolitical instability. You got to remember, we have the Ukraine war going on. We had the tensions with China, but yet this changing generational values was the top disruptor seen by business. And I think if you pull the thread on that, you start to understand major concerns in business about talent, about how they're going to manage their employees of the future. And that cuts across on a wide array of issues, not the least of which is speaking out on social issues that we could maybe get into later. But the other changes are just the values of consumerism. Mm-hmm. And so there's some significant differences there that leaders, I think, are concerned about. And so that's why you've seen the flexibility, I think, that most leaders have taken with this hybrid work from home approach, where they're trying to be far more, holding on more loosely with their talent, in a very sort of almost, until recently, a very sort of pro-labor market, which we're obviously seeing, with the unions and others.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting dance that's going on right now between, the company hierarchy and the new employees that are coming in, and the different perspectives that each have on what the workplace should be. And it will be fascinating, actually, to see how that all plays out in the next decade.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting behind it is the idea of capitalism and how those different generations are seeing capitalism. Yeah. And, back in my day, when I started, as a young guy in the late 80s working, it was just get in, put your head down, go to work, get from the small cubicle to the slightly bigger cubicle, and just keep doing a great job and put your head down, and it's all going to work out for you. That's real different today. We just did some recent polling with USA Today and actually Forbes on the business side. And we found that 8 in 10 Americans think that capitalism needs to evolve. And nearly half of them said it's heading in the wrong direction. And one of the most major indictments, I think, on capitalism is that 2/3 of Americans, 62%, say that capitalism isn't working for younger generations as it did for older ones. And, with over half of all Americans of all ages saying that capitalism today, only half say it will positively impact their future financial situation. So what you're seeing there is income inequality. You're seeing, lots of challenges related to American competitiveness abroad that's impacting the future of workers. And so, you have half the country that basically is sort of cynical on that model. And the group that's really leading that cynicism, Randy, are Gen Z.
Mm-hmm.
We asked a bunch of questions about the American dream. And again, 2/3 of Americans just believe that younger generations are facing hardships that they never had to face. And so really interesting, 3/4 of these Gen Z and millennials say they've had to adjust what the American dream means to them. Yeah. So there's a recalibration, I think, that's going on.
Well, and their generation that faced a significant amount of impact when they were growing up. I mean, they, 9/11, I think 3 major recessions in their lifetime so far. And so they just had a lot of issues that they've grown up with. So I would imagine, just like we have been shaped by the events that impacted us when we grew up, I think they've had the most of any generation, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, we see it in the data. To your point, Randy, 71% of Gen Z said that they feel like they're starting further behind in their finances than their parents were at their age. Mm-hmm. And so that's a real big challenge that takes its way all the way through. And now with rising interest rates and mortgages, sort of those stepping blocks of the way we might have defined the American dream, doesn't mean the American dream doesn't exist. It does. It's just different. And so the way it's different is sort of shifting. Young people are questioning, maybe they're not going to be homeowners. Yeah. Maybe they're going to adapt and be renters. Maybe they're going to live in lots of different places. Maybe they're not going to live in traditional cities that they might have flocked to at one point. So a lot of that is sort of what's in play right now.
So what's your perspective on the current state of leadership in our society today?
Not good.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what's interesting in our data, Randy, is there's not a lot of respect for leaders on the national level, but on the local level, it's an entirely different game. Because at the local level, in community board meetings or community organizers or PTAs or whatever you step up to do, those are highly trusted. Now, certainly they're politically combative as well at times. Anybody who's ever served on those knows that. But when you talk to Americans, they feel that that's where they can make an impact. And the truth is there's lots of really, really good things that are happening at the local level, and a lot more trust in local news, a lot more trust in local leadership. And so I think that's one big area. I think the problem on the national level is it's a zero-sum game. It's very cynical. Yeah. It's very political. There's no sense of any progress being made. And so, when we look at our data, the youth are really speaking out. I'm looking at this stat from a poll last week, Randy, but 77% of Gen Z and millennials argue that older generations aren't taking responsibility for the world they created. And 7 in 10 say that they refuse to step out of the way for younger leaders. And so these same folks, Gen Z, millennials, 77%, these are big numbers, are arguing for age caps for politicians. And the same number want their generation to have a greater impact. Yeah. So I think that's a generational shift that we're seeing right now, a real generational gap, not unlike maybe the difference between the 60s and the 50s right now on a lot of these issues. And I should mention they cut across party. We see younger conservative Gen Z folks that are still very concerned about climate and other issues. Yeah. So there's just a sense that not enough is getting done. Yeah. Well, and they want to take action.
Yeah, well, I kind of feel that way, and I'm not part of that group. You kind of look at the polarization that has occurred over the last decade, and it's not healthy. And so, how do we get past that piece of it?
Absolutely. An easy one, not an easy one, rather. I think it's it's really important to sort of bring in more voices into the solutions. And I think that's kind of what that previous data was arguing. We just did some research that was real hopeful, Randy. We worked with the Black Economic Alliance. And this is a tremendous organization that works with America's companies and their leaders. And we were concerned whether or not the recent Supreme Court rulings on affirmative action were going to work their way into corporate America. And what was fascinating to us was that 81% of Americans believe that corporate America should reflect the diversity of the American population. Yeah. And we didn't ask this question in a political way. We asked it in a real sensible way. And so framing is everything. But what was real interesting is they said why that was the case was they felt that companies that had diversity, they were 87% were going to do a better job at innovating. 84% they'd be more profitable. 79% would have greater employee retention. And the reason they'd be more profitable is that 82% thought they'd provide better customer service.
Yeah.
So, I think that's just an argument for bringing more voices into solutions and problems and, opening up the town square.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I co-chaired a 21st Century Fire and Emergency Services report, and one of the 8 critical issues that we identified for our profession was inclusiveness. And inclusiveness, of course, is diversifying, being a reflective workforce of the people that you serve, pretty important. And also, the inclusiveness piece is once you bring people in that are reflective of the community or your customer base, that you have to actually engage them in designing the work that they're going to be doing. And it's there's that old quote that, and I can't remember her name, you may remember, but I think she said that, diversity is being asked to the dance, and inclusiveness is being asked to dance.
Oh, that's really well said.
So, from an that kind of puts it into an organizational perspective. It's not only bringing the people into your organization that are reflective of who you're serving, but it's also about engaging them to help your organization grow the correct and appropriate way as it moves into the future. And so many organizations today, they're not built that way, I don't think. And so it's going to be kind of fun to watch how they migrate over the next decade or so.
Absolutely. Leaders need to be better listeners, and they need to share power. And that's kind of an anathema to lots of leadership beliefs. But, we're seeing that employed with many of our clients. They have Gen Z board advisors that come in and really give the leaders a sense of the pulse of the company and what they think they should be doing to solve problems and solutions. So, and putting more people into positions of authority early on, I think is another really key important aspect, because the business is changing. Yeah. In my business, it's trying to understand society. I've got to have young people on the line that understand the pulse of the trends.
Yeah, very important. And those are smart CEOs to be doing that now, because as we know, big organizations don't move very quickly sometimes. And so quicker that you can get that information on the front end, the better you will be off, long term. Yeah. So for the next generation of leaders coming up, what do you see some of the issues that are emerging that they're going to have to address?
Well, I think we're obviously in this, as you described, a very polarized, highly politicized environment that has been very cynical and not very productive, as I think we both agree. But what's really interesting are sort of the emergence of old-fashioned values that are very important to young people, as well as the key to Americans. We had an interesting discussion around speaking out on social issues. You might have read that companies like Disney and companies like, Anheuser-Busch have been kind of caught in the vortex of some of the politics. And what was real interesting was the idea of your values and being clear about them and sort of clinging to them in a way that would be refreshing. And we do an annual corporate reputation survey with Axios. And Randy, in the top 5 of our most respected companies, number 1 was Patagonia, and number 5 was Chick-fil-A. And I want you to imagine those 2 companies at the same corporate picnic, right? Real different companies. Yeah. But you know what Americans say? You know what? They respect them because they walk their talk. Yeah. They're consistent on their values. They're clear. They're unwavering. And so you know where they're coming from. And I think that's so important today because Americans think that companies speaking out on social issues, 3/4 of them, 67%, say it's a marketing ploy. You're just trying to virtue signal or curry some favors to sort of make your company look good versus doing the hard work of living your values. And this was fascinating to us, Randy, but 77% of all Americans said they would respect companies more if they were clear in their values, even if they disagreed with them. And that included 79% of Democrats and 77% of Republicans. So
that's an amazing
I think when you think about leadership in the future, but you have to think about the practical applications of that. Like, if you're a company on the West Coast or East Coast, like here in New York, how many Republicans do you have in your leadership? How many Republicans do you have in your company? Are you in your own sort of echo chamber if you're on the red or the blue? Because that's what we need today. I mean, we need some companies to be sort of true to their values and also sort of be open enough to be able to kind of debate those and then make decisions on them and be more clear, I think.
Yeah, I think, and it points to the fact that diversity is not only what we look like, it's also about diversity of thought and how important that is. And
back to those old-fashioned values, we asked a question about trust, because trust sort of became just an attribute that you took for granted back in the day. But today, 88% say trust might be old-fashioned, but it's more important than ever before.
Yeah.
And so, they're saying that we need companies to be reliable, to be transparent. Those are the things I think that people are looking for. So the hope there is that some of these maybe old virtues could sort of be rekindled and reapplied to today's challenges.
Well, I think they will be in corporate America because they're driven by ultimately the dollar, right, and the investments that are made in them. So they will make that shift. I'm not so sure about government. I'm hopeful.
Local government.
Yeah, local government, I think is it's all government's local. I mean, that's just the way it is. You get most of 90% and 95% of your services from local government, so that's the touchstone. But at the federal level, hopefully, they get to the point where they just do the right thing, make the right decisions, and don't do it from a political perspective, but do it for what's right for the people that they represent. And if they would just, do some core tenet things, I think that they would be a lot better off.
Absolutely.
So what advice would you give to this next generation in respect to making a difference in their own life journey?
Well, I think one of the biggest things I've learned since the pandemic is the sheer weight of society on young people. Mm-hmm. And we know this from our work that we do with the American Psychological Association and a recent poll that we just did last month with Blue Cross Blue Shield of California. But mental health and wellness is a crisis. It's a public health crisis in our country. Yeah. And while it affects all Americans, it's disproportionately really affecting young people. We see in our data, 87% of Gen Z feel like they are experiencing some aspects of mental health challenges regularly, and 58% experience anxiety regularly. And so a lot of that, and I can go on and on with the data, but I'll just shorthand it and say that they think climate is an existential threat. They think toxic politics and division is an existential threat. And I think if you go back to some of our listeners who might remind themselves of what it was like to be 16 to 20 and trying to figure yourself out and figure out where you're going, you did have sort of tremendous respect in bedrock institutions and in leaders, whether you disagreed with them or agreed with them. But you didn't have this environment today where it felt like the ground was cracking under your feet. Yeah. So they're worried about all these issues. At the same time, they're trying to navigate themselves. Now, we haven't even talked about social media. We haven't talked about digital devices and distraction. We haven't talked about, the expense of education and all the economic sort of headwinds that they're facing. So I think what's really important is for them to keep doing what they're already doing, which is that they're the first generation, Randy, that is destigmatizing counseling, mental health and wellness. I mean, they're far more open to talking about therapy with their peers, to getting and seeking help. And they could teach all of us a lot about that. And I think that is something we have to really pay attention to as these young people sort of move their way into developing families. But I think that's a major challenge. And, we have 6 in 10 say that young people say they are experiencing barriers in accessing professional mental health care. Yeah. So, this to me is as important as the physical health care as we think about navigating our future.
Yeah, and I think your observation about, just looking back at, the people that will listen to this podcast and think about when you were growing up, what were you worried about? Because we weren't really worried about, are we going to be attacked from a foreign country? We weren't worried about climate. We weren't worried about really going to school because it was relatively affordable. And we figured that, we'd get a job and pay the loan back and it wasn't a big deal. And they've got a lot on their plate. Plus, we didn't have the distractions of social media, and that brings with it, I think, another level of intensity that we didn't have. And distraction, if you will, but in a lot more information that they're dealing with and going through. So, yeah, they've had a tough road thus far in their life, and hopefully it gets a little bit smoother for them as they go up or as they grow older.
Yeah, and this might sound a bit old-fashioned, but I try my hardest with young people. If I get reached out on LinkedIn and they want to do a quick informational interview, I'll make sure it happens. Yeah. This idea of platforming people, because if you can just give young people a shot, and young people of color and women of color, whatever you're trying to do, but just realize that if you've got some position of power and authority, these things do not take a lot of time and they can make a significant difference.
Yeah, no, totally agree. I talk with 2 or 3 young folks a month that they'll reach out and say, just want to talk about, what's it like to be, in the fire service, or sometimes it's a leadership question, and you're right. It's a small investment of time that may make a huge difference in their path, and that's the best reward that we can have.
I found some great researchers that way, Randy.
Yeah. Well, that's we're always looking, right? So,
right.
John, anything else you'd like to finish up with today? Any final thoughts?
Well, I just know I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really commend you for what you're doing. And, I think this is a really exciting and challenging time, challenging. I think we've hit on a lot, but I continue to look at the infusion of young energy into the problems that we're facing today. And there's a lot of great stuff going on. If you look around at, as we've talked about at the local level, there's emergent new models of leadership. There's new interesting public-private partnerships. There's just creative uses in government at local levels, and some really great stuff that's happening. What we got to do is piece all that together into a new quilt, and we'll be on our way.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thanks so much for being on our podcast today, and we'll have you back. Maybe we can have you back once a year, and you can kind of give us an update on what's going on.
That'd be great. Yeah. I really appreciate it, and thanks again for all your service.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Leadership Crucible podcast. If you have a story of adversity you'd like to share, we'd love to hear it. Join us next time as we continue to explore how to live lives of success and significance.